receiving this book, this very interesting book, my first thought really was relief, because Malachi had told me that he was sending this. He told me the title, and when he told me that it was called How to Fix Northern Ireland, I thought it was going to be much longer than it turned out to be. So it's mercifully short, and you will fly through the chapters. It's also the case that by complete coincidence, just after I had been asked to come along and say a few words here, I was down in the newspaper library doing some research for our Good Friday Agreement coverage, going through old Belfast Telegraphs. And in the course of that, from some old Belfast Telegraphs in, I think it was March 1998, I came across a column which Malachi had written at that point. And he is, of course, to this day, a very well-loved and a very talented Belfast Telegraph columnist, but he was equally prolific and equally thought-provoking at that point. However, I was slightly surprised by some of what he said in this column, and wonder whether I would necessarily have got away with this. So he was writing about the Alliance Party, and this is a book which essentially is about the ugliness of sectarianism, about how sectarianism is at the heart of so much, maybe everything, which is broken in Northern Irish society, and that whatever about the constitutional future of Northern Ireland, whether it's British or Irish or something in between or completely out on its own, this is a problem which is at the heart of our difficulty. And he was writing this column in 1998, making some quite similar points, albeit much more succinctly, but he was writing particularly about the Alliance Party, led at that point by Lord Alderdice, David Alderdice, who had a very, and has to this day, a very distinguished beard, very distinguished black beard. Malachi, of course, is bearded as well. And I was surprised that Malachi thought that this was an obstacle to him as a politician, and so he really thought that the Alliance Party needed to do something to break out beyond the way it was perceived at that point. So he said, maybe it's time for a makeover. I would get rid of that beard, or trim it back to stubble. I would get him out night clubbing. There has to be something slightly dangerous about a politician here, and if it can't be the whiff of cordite or bilious religion, then perhaps it ought to be a finely cultivated sexual charisma. Now, I'm not sure if there was any reaction to that column at the time. I'm not sure if it had any impact on the Alliance Party's political fortunes or not. They obviously have a very different leader these days. But Malachi is somebody who has always been thought-provoking. He's always been thoughtful. He's always somebody who thinks and who makes you think when you read his columns. I remember very clearly as a child growing up, the Belfast Telegraph being in the house, as much because my dad was wanting to buy something from it, or mum was wanting to check a death notice, as because of what was on the front page. And Malachi would be there. I remember Dad listening to Talkback, and I remember distinctly Malachi's very distinctive segments on that programme, on Hearts and Minds, the dearly departed Hearts and Minds, that great juxtaposition of Malachi and other commentators pushing the boundaries, I suppose, of what's possible on the BBC is very opinionated columnist type material on a public service broadcaster with Ian Knox's cartoons. And so he is someone who is part of the fabric of Northern Ireland and has been for decades. He is a writer of great integrity, and I know from speaking to a couple of people as we were gathering outside, that's what they were mentioning about his honesty, about the way he writes about his subjects, about the self-reflective aspect of how he approaches his topics, and about how he has questioned his own beliefs, how he's questioned the side of the Northern Ireland community into which he was born. He hasn't simply said, well, you know what, I'm born in West Belfast, this is what I should think, that's it. He said, well, actually, hang on a minute, do I really think that? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no, that doesn't really make sense to me. There aren't very many people in Northern Ireland who have done that at all, and I don't think there is anybody, perhaps, who has done that with so much flair and with such panache as Malachi has done. He's also an incredibly prolific author. It seems like he churns out a book every 6 months. Having written one book in my life and not even considered starting another one ever since, I have no idea how he manages to do that while also writing regular newspaper columns, etc. And in this book, he dissects and distills the ugliness, the brutal ugliness of sectarianism. And he does it in a way that isn't boring, even to people like us, and I'm assuming most people here live in Northern Ireland, are from Northern Ireland. Lots of this stuff can seem quite worthy, but quite dull. Sectarianism's bad. Well, we know it's bad. You know, come on, tell us something else. And he does tell us something else. He makes us question it. He makes us think about things that are sectarian in our own attitudes to people, things that we might not necessarily think about. And one of the things that I was struck by was that he contrasts Northern Ireland, as he often does in his books, with places like India, which he obviously knows very well, and with other parts of the world. And he puts it into a wider international context. And for instance, he says, some divided communities in other countries suffer the complication of physical distinction between the people of the factions. Belfast would be easier to read if Protestants and Catholics had different skin colour. Then it might not be possible to have the relaxed mingling in the city centre, and they might divide into separate bars. Or if they had different attire, the way that you can distinguish a Hindu from a Muslim in Uttar Pradesh, we would be perpetually aware of difference. But there are no strong distinguishing features to warn you in Belfast that you're not among your own. Not until you start talking to each other. And he goes on in great detail. He talks about how the influence of the churches at one point was central to sectarianism. People were very literally divided on faith. They were divided on whether they knew it or not. They were divided on issues like transubstantiation and justification by faith alone, and things that probably they didn't even think about, but that's what their faith taught, and that's what divided them from the other sort in Northern Ireland. That obviously is not the case for the vast majority of people today, and it's one of the things that is intriguing, that is perplexing about sectarianism, that it has outlasted, in some ways, that which gave it birth, because the churches now have incredibly warm relations, the main churches. I've had, I think, about 3 statements this week in my inbox from the churches, from Eamon Martin, from John McDowell, from the various church leaders, jointly calling for this or that around the Good Friday Agreement, around the marking of Easter as a Christian holiday, etc. And yet parts of Northern Ireland are burning at the moment, and people are being put out of their homes within communities, and there is the ugliness of cross-community sectarianism. And one other, I'll be mercifully short as the book is here, so I'm almost done, I can assure you, but one of the other things that he dwells on here is that in the terms that are used often by loyalists, and to a slightly lesser extent by Republicans, but both sides use these terms, they refer to the PUL community, the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, and the CNR community, really quite ugly terms these, frankly, even aside from what they represent, the Catholic Nationalist Republican community. And he makes the point that that these are labels for huge groups of people who have different ideas about the world in all sorts of ways, different genders, different sexualities, different views as to whether they believe in God at all, even if they're being described as Protestant or Catholic, and all manner of other differences. And yet these are convenient labels because actually in some ways they do tell us something as a predictor of how those people are likely to think about certain things, until, that is, it gets to a member of one of those two communities, groups, doing something that is seen as so reprehensible, so indefensible, that the people in the group say, well, that's not really representative of us. And what he does in the book is draw out the example of the incredibly disturbing and sectarian singing about the death of Michaela McAreevy by loyalists after an orange parade in I think an orange hall, and massive publicity around it. Some of those involved apologised ultimately once they were publicly shamed, etc. But what causes people to do that, and what causes other people who are either Protestant or Unionist or Loyalist or in some way identify with one of those labels or all of those labels to say, that's not representative of our community? Well, Malachi makes the point, it's not, in the sense that the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland do not subscribe to that sort of gross, extreme form of sectarianism. That's why it was so shocking, that's why it was so newsworthy. But actually, they're all part of one community as they describe it, and they see themselves in these terms. And so what is it that binds these people together by choice? But when something like this happens, they feel a responsibility to come out and say, "You're not speaking for me." Well, if it was someone else who didn't feel part of that community and didn't think that those people who did that appalling act were part of that community, they wouldn't feel the need to do that because it would so obviously not reflect on them. So actually, these labels are both almost unavoidable, I think, as shorthand for trying to explain Northern Ireland in simple and concise terms, but actually really problematic and in some cases perpetuate sectarianism. Just finally, something about this which I think you, if you haven't read it already, or for anybody here who has seen some of the advanced copies, will certainly realise, is that in this book there are all sorts of examples. Sport, newspapers. Newspapers is something that particularly struck home with me because that's where I spent most of my days writing. The level to which Northern Ireland is divided is astonishing. And when we look at this objectively, as Malachi has done in this book, and when you break it down chapter by chapter, segment by segment, people buried. I was talking to somebody yesterday from the northwest of Northern Ireland, and he was talking to me about how in the local graveyard people are divided in death. There is almost an invisible line in the graveyard over which certain people do not cross in terms of where they want to be buried. That is staggering to me. We know about sectarianism, we know what it means, but when you break it down into its component parts, it actually becomes pretty absurd in many cases. Not all of it is absurd. It's not absurd for people to want to live with people of their own background because they feel threatened by people of another background. That's quite logical. That's totally explicable. But when you actually break down the component parts of sectarianism, so much of it is actually really bonkers. You'll be glad to hear that you've heard everything from me, and you're now going to hear from the man himself. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce somebody who does not need to be introduced here, doesn't need to be introduced very many places, but I'll do it anyway, because I've been asked to do it. So Malachi O'Doherty, please give him a warm round of applause.
It is such a pleasure to be back here and among people who've been coming to these book launches now for some years. I was just totting it up, 6 and 7 years. This is my 12th book, so I've made the dozen. Apart from a couple I'm embarrassed by, I won't mention anymore. But the run of political books really started with the Gerry Adams biography in 2017. And in 2019, then it was the 50 Years On book, looking back at the Civil Rights Movement. In 2020, there was a novel, Terry Branken Has a Gun, which didn't sell very well because lockdown immediately followed. And then after that, in 2021, we had The Year of Chaos, looking back at the period 71 to 72. And after that, we had, last September, we had Can Ireland Be One? A survey of the question of United Ireland and its viability. And now we have How to Fix Northern Ireland in the, so 6 books in 7 years. I take some credit for that. But I also extend some of that credit to people who've been supporting me so much, not least by buying these books and by coming to these launches. But at the same time, I came here tonight and I thought I was getting so many comments on my shirt. I should be launching the shirt instead of the book. And perhaps I've actually done 3 more books in shirts in the past 7 years. So the shirt is a present from Maureen this morning to mark this occasion. And I don't know if you know, but then one of Maureen's fixations is botany, and she has noticed that she takes pleasure in spotting poets who get their botanical details wrong, and we're not going to embarrass any poets by naming them, but they should know who they are, And this one has got strawberries, but it's the leaf plant is entirely wrong for the strawberry plant, but we'll live with that, So I'm very grateful to Sam for his very, very kind words. I've totally forgotten writing any suggestion that John Alderdice should cultivate sexual charisma. I think John and I would both agree it's probably too late now. And also thanks to David and Torrance of No Alibis, who's been such a supporter of local writing and publishing, and without whom, you know, many of the great book launch occasions in Belfast, not just mine, but so many others, would not have taken place. I'm going to read you a wee bit of the book, and not to hold you back too long. There is, you know, as Sam pointed out, it's almost like a collection of essays on different facets of the sectarian experience, looking at territorial divisions, looking at the churches, looking at political party organisation, looking at language and culture and so on. And I have a chapter on mixed marriage. When I was reading for this book, Anthony Buckley's book on negotiating identity, published back in the 90s, he said that one of the key drivers of sectarian division in Northern Ireland, in fact he thought it was the key driver, was the sanction against mixed marriage. And I thought, well, we have to find a mixed marriage couple to talk to. Do we know anybody? And like that, we had 5 of them, you know, I suddenly realised it is so common now. You know, there is a mixed marriage association still, but it's not nearly as busy as it was. But still in all, I've used pseudonyms for the mixed marriage couples that I've interviewed here, and they are Frank and Rosie and Eileen and Ross. So I'll just read you a wee bit of their story. Frank and Rosie agreed to talk to me. Frank is a boffin of some kind. He works in computers on a level beyond my comprehension and travels for his job. Rosie is a substitute teacher and is available to schools which need temporary staff to cover for sickness, maternity leave, whatever. She has worked in both Catholic and state schools, which are essentially Protestant. Frank says, it's strange to me that there's such a thing as a mixed marriage association. It's normal to me. There were no voices in my family saying they didn't really like this. None at all. Rosie's experience was a little different. My mum is a feminist, and she only said it the other day how much she cannot have Catholicism. Rosie was deeply religious in her childhood and speaks of her Pentecostal background as a painful connection that occasionally causes her anxiety about whether she has drifted too far from God. She wanted a religious ceremony for her wedding, but not in a church. The compromise was to hold it in a hotel with a liberal-minded Methodist minister cheerfully conducting the service. Then after the wedding, as they started to have children, Rosie found herself moving closer to the Catholic Church, not because Frank wanted her to, but because she wanted to go to church and find the Catholic context more genial. She isn't allowed to receive communion in a Catholic church, but doesn't mind going forward to receive a blessing. Frank never goes to communion. I don't go to Mass unless Rosie brings me. Am I a believer? We could talk all night about that. I would be lying if I said I didn't get something out of it. I kind of zone out. It's very similar to doing a meditation. He has been to services in Protestant churches too. Eileen and Ross also decided to raise their children as Catholics. This was what the church in past generations would have insisted on, yet both couples volunteered for it. Ross, the Protestant, says, we tried to be sensible. We decided they would be Catholics for the simple reason that we were going to be living in a Catholic community. I was going to make it easier for them to fit in. Eileen was still a churchgoer at that time in her life. Ross says, I have never been a church person. Well, I used to be. I went to Sunday school and to church every Sunday, but I saw so much wrong with the Presbyterian church when I was younger. To me, it was all about money and who was wearing the nicest hat. To me, that is not being a good Christian. He had even been a member of the Orange Order as a boy and marched on the 12th. Frank and Rosie were more likely to find each other than Ross and Eileen were. In a city centre pub in Belfast, young men and women would meet and connect without knowing until they got closer, whether they were from the same religious background. In many ways, sectarianism functions like ordinary racism, without, as Sam reminded us, but without the obvious marker of skin colour, so connections are easier to make at first. Eileen says, ironically, I would say we would never have met, only that I went from the Catholic school to the high school to do an A-level. Doing so, I met a group of girls that I became friendly with, and it was one of them that introduced me to Ross. One night I was out and one of the girls said, come on over, there's a boy who wants to meet you in the pub across the road. That was the pub the Protestants went to. I was in the Catholic pub. I swear you couldn't make it up. We went over and that's how I met Ross. Both couples discovered in time that the wider extended families had secrets to guard. Frank had a cousin who had been in the IRA. Ross had a brother in the British Army. Frank assured Rosie that his IRA cousin was regarded as a bit of a balloon in the family, though the IRA regarded him as a hero. Ross was simply not allowed to tell Eileen that about his soldier brother. She lived in an area where many Republicans lived, and until Ross's family knew her better, they were not going to confide information to her that night that might, through her, even inadvertently, reach someone who would be a threat. Rosie and Frank also encountered that wariness among people in the security services who would keep their distance from a Catholic they didn't know. We went up to this barbecue with my brother, and a lot of his friends were in the police, and they would not take Frank under their notice. It was like they had their Catholic radar on. It was deeply uncomfortable, and I was so ashamed. Now, they weren't my friends. I knew the host, but the taste in my mouth made me feel I would never move back home. Both Rosie and Eileen have been school teachers and have worked in schools across the divide and been challenged by pupils from a different background. Eileen says, I remember once we were doing a Heaney poem that has some Irish in it, and I spoke the Irish, and this girl went, are you one of them? I said, what do you mean? And she apologised. She said, I just know because Catholics are far more crack. Then she asked me if I could speak Irish, and I said I knew a bit, and they were genuinely interested. And I remember one child said, and do you believe in it? And I said, yes. I don't really go to church, but I was thinking, don't bloody well start coming at me, girl. It was an interesting conversation, and it was a safe conversation in a nice room with nice kids. Rosie's experience was similar. Scrutiny first expressed as suspicion, and then turning into curiosity. There was a child in a Catholic school where I was teaching, and I was teaching about Christina Rossetti and just how puritanical she was. And I was on a rant about puritanical Christians, and I finally said, but not all Protestants are like that. Some of us are very normal. And the wee girl went, wow, and the jaw dropped, and she went, are you a Protestant? And I said, yeah, I am. I swear her jaw was still there by the end of the lesson. She says she knows one school where a child was discovered to be a Protestant and was bullied so much that he had to move class. The kids in the class he was moved to were fine with him, but there was a clique in the first class that weren't going to accept him. I know a story that contrasts with that about a child who came home from a mixed school and told his mother that some of the children there had called him a taig. The mother told me, I complained, and the head called in the parents of the kids, told them they'd be expelled if they did that again. That stopped it. While Frank's family is Irish and Catholic, his parents took care to give their children names that didn't immediately mark them out. Didn't call them names like Malachi. They felt they were fortunate to have a surname that didn't brand them either, not like O'Doherty. For many of us, when we introduce ourselves, we're immediately identified as belonging to one side or the other. An Irish name like mine says Catholic, with nationalism implied. Protestants often do something that Catholics don't. They name a child with a surname from the extended family. So I know a man whose first name is Johnson, another whose first name is Wilson. If you tell me your name is Watson Curry or Morgan Hatfield, I will know you're a Protestant. If you're Seamus O'Connor or Saoirse Donnelly, you're a Catholic. Frank and Rosie's children are now baptised Catholics who have made their first Holy Communion and go to Catholic schools. It worries Rosie's mother, though she attended the baptisms. She had to stay away from the first communions because of COVID-19, so they don't know for sure if she would have been happy to go. Occasionally there are indications that the children are growing up with beliefs that are alien and unattractive to Rosie. When she lost something, one of her children said she should pray to St. Anthony. That's his delegated role in heaven, to find things. Rosie explained that as a Protestant, she didn't do that. Frank says, that's why she can never find anything. So thank you very much. The main purpose of the night is to sell books, obviously. We will be going into the theatre next door. There will be wine. And I will sign books for anyone who'd like to sign them. Anyone would buy it and not have it signed, that's fine as well. Whatever. Anyway, that's what we're doing now. We're moving next door into the adjacent theatre, and that's where we will have the signing and drink wine, and we can mingle socially and get to know one another better. Find out who's a Protestant.